Shalom, friends. Good morning to those on the stateside. Good evening from here in Jerusalem. And I think that a good friend of mine, an attorney and a childhood friend who's joining us, I think for the first time, from Israel. So there is an Israeli contingency beyond myself. We have a daunting challenge ahead of us today. The attempt is to cover two topics in our webinar today. But first, let me acknowledge with thanks the co-sponsors of our programs, the J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and at least two co-chairs are with us, Judge Peter Buxbaum and attorney David Light. The third one I know is unable to join us because of a conflict. And the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and Steve Greenwald, past president of the American Association, is with us. And Hiddush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality, and quite a number of colleagues who are members of Hiddush are here. So it's a privilege to be together again, and at this time with a very, as I said, challenging task. What we will try to do is cover both the hot, fresh out of the oven findings of the 2023 Israel Religion and State Index, which we publish annually on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. We released it yesterday, and in a few days we will hopefully have an English version, which we will send to all of you. Obviously, we will not be able to cover all of it, not even most of it, but I'll try and touch quickly some of the ongoing findings, the patterns, the main elements that make up the views of the adult Jewish population in Israel regarding matters of religion and state, without which it is very difficult to understand what makes Israelis tick when it comes to these issues, and really beyond these issues, as you will shortly see. And the other is the historic hearing before the Supreme Court that took place last week for the first time in Israel's history. The whole panel of the Supreme Court, all 15 judges, set to judgment in probably the most important constitutional case in the history of the State of Israel. I will try to make some sense of it for those who have not been following it or are not familiar with the material of the constitutional law and cases coming before the Israeli Supreme Court. But I urge you to write questions, queries, and use the chat for that. And if we don't manage to respond to them all, I will try and follow up. And when we send you the recording, I'll try to also cover questions that we would not be able to cover together today. So let me start with the Religion and State Index. Let me start at the beginning, namely something that those who have heard me last year provide a briefing on the index, and those who have heard me on other occasions, because we've been running the annual Religion and State Index since 2009, when Hiddush was founded. We ask the same questions every year, and then more questions that are topical questions and that have to do with the events of the time. And obviously, we have added questions this time regarding what we refer to as the judicial upheaval, and what the government prefers to call the judicial reforms or the legal reforms. and what some who take an even dimmer view of the government's intentions and initiatives call a coup. So we have had a number of speakers on the merits of the judicial upheaval. We had Professor Rivka Weil, and the last webinar was with MK Rabbi Gilad Kariv, and before that we had Professor Susie Navot. And so we've covered it from a number of legal angles, and also an excellent webinar that we had with Professor Yofi Tirosh, who covered the women's angle, the gender equality aspects of the judicial upheaval. All right, so let me run through some of the findings. First of all, as I said, as I hinted before, you can't really understand what goes on in Israel, and you have a difficult time understanding Israelis if you don't understand the following three graphs, three breakdowns of who the Israeli Jews are. So, one question that we ask, and many others ask in the same manner, and mostly the Central Bureau of Statistics, is how do you define yourself religiously? Do you define yourself as ultra-Orthodox, religious or national religious, traditional close to religion, traditional non-religious, or secular? And what you see is that some 64%, and then figure varies. You have to remember the limitations on the statistical, margin of error, 3.5%. So the number is now 64. It was 65 last year, if I remember correctly. In any case, 64% identify themselves religiously as either secular or traditional non-religious. I'm combining the two together, and you will soon see why. I will provide the context for that, because on many of the public policy issues, the laws regarding the whole of the Jewish population or the whole of the population in Israel on religious issues, those who define themselves as traditional non-religious tend to give the same answers, or answers close to those of the secular. So some 64% identify themselves as either secular or traditional non-religious. Now, when we come to political worldview, we see sort of the reverse in terms of the breakdown. What we see is that 67% identify themselves as either right-wing, very right-wing, or centrist right-leaning. Namely, 67%, and by the way, you really don't have to write anything. I'll be sending you this PowerPoint presentation along with the recording. So 67% identify themselves as being right of center, and only 16% identify themselves as being left of center. Clearly, you all realize that this is a very different breakdown of the population based on political worldview when we compare Israeli Jews to American Jews. But that's where we are now. We weren't there some decades ago. We may not be there a few decades from now, but that's the picture. 67% on the right of center, 64% secular or traditional non-religious. Now, of course, with the participants that we have today on the webinar, you will also ask the question, well, what about the streams of Judaism? So we asked that question too, and what you see is that for most adult Israeli Jews, now this is an expanded or extended sample of the adult Jewish population in Israel. Usually the polls are conducted with a representative sample of 500. We use 800. In our original poll back in 2009, we used 1,200. And what you see is that for most adult Israeli Jews, they don't see themselves as belonging to any stream of Judaism. So 57% do not identify with any stream of Judaism. They are, I guess, what you call in America in the polls, just Jews. But others do identify with the streams. Now, we use very careful language. We use the language, לאיזה זרם אתם משייכים את עצמכם. With which stream do you affiliate yourself? With affiliate yourself, or do you consider to belong to, we do not mean the formal membership route, belong to a synagogue and pay membership dues. But we are talking about more than just identify with, but rather ask, where do you feel belonging to in terms of the streams of Judaism? And what you see is 9% respond Reform or Conservative. In the past, and again, please bear in mind, margin of error, we had as much as 11 or 12%. And other polls also indicated comparable figures. So 11% ultra-Orthodox, 2% Zionist ultra-Orthodox, 21% religious Zionist. Now, please bear in mind, this is not that 21% are modern religious or Zionist religious. This is how people subjectively align themselves. As you may remember, only 12% identify themselves as religious or as national religious, but more align themselves with that. So on the one hand, there is a good showing of Reform and Conservative. This is very far from the years in which people claimed that, there is really no Reform or Conservative. Reform or Conservative doesn't resonate with Israelis. It's quite close to the 11% of the ultra-Orthodox representation in Israel. But at the same time, it gives you a picture that the Israeli pluralism scene is not identical to the American pluralism scene. At another time, we could probably speak a lot more about it as to, what makes up the Jewish identity of the Israeli Jew. Now, I'm going to cover a few political questions which bear on the last elections, the makeup of the government, and the judicial upheaval. So what we see is that the current government that has 64 seats out of the 120, it's a slim majority. Each one of the constituent parties that make up the coalition, leaving the coalition would bring down the government. Therefore, the ultra-Orthodox parties, United Torah Judaism, the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party, and Shas, the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party, are essential for Netanyahu and the Likud to include in order to be able to muster a majority at the Knesset and be able to head the government. Now, how do Israeli Jews feel about it? Well, they hate it. They hated it in the past, they hate it now, and you will see that on quite a number of issues, especially issues involving religion and state, there is a gap, there is a gaping hole, there is a void between where the public is and where the politicians are. What to do about it, how to go about it, that of course is what we are trying to decipher over the years, and to some extent, the protest movement in Israel has now expanded its horizons to include these issues and is addressing them as well. So 64% say we want a coalition which is going to be a civil coalition, civil parties, no ultra-Orthodox, or if you include ultra-Orthodox parties, you should not be succumbing to their demands. Only 36% support a coalition that's based on the ultra-Orthodox parties. Now, here is a very interesting graph that shows how people responded to that question since 2018. And what you can see that in 2022, when 44% said, sure, include ultra-Orthodox parties in the coalition, that dropped down to 36%. And whereas a majority of 55% in 2022 said, no, we don't want the ultra-Orthodox parties in the coalition, or at least not to heed to their dictates, the figure jumped to 64%, up from 55 to 64% between 2022 and 2023. Now, as you can see, there were years already before in which there was that kind of level of resentment, but it went down in 2021 and then 2022, and now it rose again dramatically. And I mentioned that the protest movement has expanded its horizons, its agenda, to include issues of religion and state, in part because the protest movement understands what the politicians refuse to accept, and certainly refuse to conduct their political affairs by. What they understand is that the public has had it, that more and more Israelis are opposing, resenting, and there's a growing level of anger about the unholy alliance of religion and state. We will see some of the specifics further down in other questions. So we asked over the years, do you support freedom of religion and conscience, which is, as you all know, the assurance given in the Declaration of Independence, Chofesh Dat u'Matzpun, and equality, complete social and political equality regardless of religion, but we ask a separate question, do you support separation of religion and state? And often I'm asked by American friends, why don't you push for separation of religion and state? And what I'm saying is that, and this is the table showing how the responses are aligned with the respective parties, the key parties that make up the Knesset. So what we are saying is, yes, for some, let's say Labor or Meretz, there is no difference. 100% of Labor Meretz voters in the November 2022 elections are saying we are for freedom of religion and conscience, and we are for separation of religion and state. But when you look, for instance, at the Likud, what you see is 85% are saying, yes, we support freedom of religion and conscience, but only 42% are saying we support separation of religion and state. So altogether, there is about 85% that support freedom of religion and conscience, whereas there is only about 60% overall that support separation of religion and state. We don't have the time to go into the details, but if this is what you are interested in, namely, so what's the difference between freedom of religion and conscience and separation of religion and state, I'll be glad to speak about it further if you ask the question on the chat or on another occasion. It certainly deserves further conversation. Now, we asked over the years again and again the question of, there are a number of domestic conflicts in Israeli society. Which do you consider to be the harshest? Which do you consider to be the most acute? And what you see is that the top conflicts, domestic conflicts, we did not ask about security. We did not ask about Jews and Arabs or Jews, Israelis and Palestinians. What you see consistently is that the top domestic conflicts that the Israeli Jewish community is facing are the conflict of political left and political right on the one hand, and the ultra-Orthodox versus secular on the other. And the ultra-Orthodox versus secular really represents the conflict of religion and state, not just specifically Haredi versus secular. Very interesting to see that those conflicts of yesteryear really practically almost disappeared. Even rich versus poor is deemed to be the most acute or second most acute. The numbers here represent most acute or second most acute together. Only 10% view the conflict of rich and poor to be the most acute or second most acute. And a conflict which many are sort of stoking again in recent years, namely between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, Sephardi and Ashkenazi, is only deemed to be most or second most acute by 19%. So it's a very important perspective, both with regard to that important conflict, but also with regard to understanding that, again, domestically, the most real acute conflicts that the Israeli society is facing is the political conflict between left and right and the conflict between religion and state, or Haredi versus secular. Now, we asked a few more questions about the judicial overhaul. So, did the recent conflict concerning the judicial overhaul influence your positions on religion and state issues? Now, on the one hand, and those of you who have heard me before and have seen our annual religion and state indices before, you know that people are pretty consistent. These are long-held views. There are some changes, there are, some eruptions, but for the most part, people have formed their opinions and they hold on to them. So 48% are saying, no, the judicial overhaul did not really impact my views, but my position remained the same. But look at the differential between those who say, yes, it reinforced my opinion about freedom of religion and freedom from religion, and assuring that the Supreme Court will protect these rights, as opposed to the opposite. Yes, it reinforced my opinion that the Jewish character of the State of Israel must be protected from interference by the Supreme Court. And we use the language that's used by the proponents of both positions. So 35% are saying I've been reinforced in my commitment to, in my resolution to, push for freedom of religion and freedom from religion, compared to 17% who say, gee, we have a problem with Jewish identity and the Supreme Court is a menace and we need to do something about it in order to safeguard the Jewish character of the State of Israel. Now, when we look at the same question, looking at it from the perspective of a political breakdown, namely how people voted in the November 22 elections, what we see is, for instance, that 24% of the Likud voters maintain that, yes, the push against the judicial, the Supreme Court has reinforced their commitment to safeguard the Jewish identity of the State of Israel, but 11% are saying no. Now, this is very interesting because this clearly has to do with the Likud's facing a challenge in terms of putting together a government, and running through, as you know, the November 22 elections, where the fifth in sequence of elections over the course of some 2 years. But look at the National Unity Party, that's Gantz, and Yesh Atid, that's Lapid, and you will see there, it's not 35%, it's 68% and 67%. And of course, Labor and Meretz, hopefully they will be represented in the next Knesset as well, 77%. What you see is that those civil parties their constituents are eager to see that freedom of religion and the Supreme Court ability to monitor and pass judicial review over these issues remains strong and intact. And I think that you can easily understand what they may bear in terms of the expected campaigning in the next elections, and there's a little bit more about that. Okay, so the same story, of course, is seen when we do the breakdown based on religious identity. 75%. So the question is, would in the coming elections, if a party that you feel close to in terms of its foreign security and economic policies commit to advance freedom of religion, would that impact on you so that it would increase the likelihood that you would vote for such a party, or decrease the likelihood that you would vote for such a party? And as you can see clearly for the secular public, the answer is yes. If a party were to commit to vote for and act toward increasing freedom of religion in Israel, we are more likely to support that party. So if there are going to be different parties, some of them or one of them pursuing freedom of religion and another saying, well, we want to hold all our cards, closed, and we want to be free to align with the Haredi parties in the next coalition, which, by the way, is not theoretical, because only about a week ago, Benny Gantz, the head of the National Unity Party, said in an interview to an ultra-Orthodox radio station that he's eager to have the Haredi parties in his coalition. So that may play if those parties are going to take these findings into consideration and shape their campaign based on that. You also see here an example of the difference between those who consider themselves to be traditional close to religion or traditional non-religious, whereas for 49% of the traditional non-religious, that would be increasing the likelihood that they would vote for such a party. Only 31% of the traditional close to religion respond that way. And the same question you see with regard to the different political camps, right-wing and very right-wing. And it's interesting to see. So 26% and 27% respond respectively to it would increase or it would decrease. And the point is that even in the right wing, there is a significant percentage, a significant sector for whom religious freedom is an important factor in the way that they see Israel. So they may be right wing when it comes to territories, when it comes to settlements, when it comes to the peace process. But when it comes to civil society, they are liberal, and they want to see religious freedom being enjoyed by them and by all in Israel. So that is a good example for the point that I'm often making, which explains why 64% say we are secular or traditional non-religious, but 67% are saying we are right-wingers. So it really the division between those who support religious freedom and those who oppose religious freedom is not identical, does not overlap that of the division between left and right. All right, so one of the main claims of the proponents of the judicial upheaval is we are there in order to retrieve the public trust in the court. The court has run astray in the pushing its nose into business that it has no business interfering with, and therefore it has lost public trust. And by initiating those judicial initiatives, which you have heard about before, so I don't want to repeat it, but basically weakening the authority, limiting the authority, limiting the independence of the Supreme Court. So by doing all of that, we are intending to actually help the court regain the public trust. Well, when you look at the real figures, and those real figures are borne also by parallel surveys that are done, for instance, by the Israel Democracy Institute. So we asked the question, in which of the following public institutions do you have the highest degree of trust? And you may mark up to 2. What you see is that the Knesset, that is now the majority, the 64 in the Knesset, that are challenging the Supreme Court and saying, you have become illegitimate. We represent the will of the people. We speak for the majority. Only 10% say we have high trust in the Knesset, compared to almost 4 times as many, 36%, who say we put high trust in the Supreme Court. Of course, the tragedy is that 40% are saying we don't have trust in any of them. But still, when you compare the Knesset to the Supreme Court, you realize, you know what? You, the Knesset, have a long way to go. You are concerned about public trust. Better take a mirror and look at yourselves first and take care of retrieving the public trust in you before you attempt to assault and sabotage the court. Now, here is an important finding, which also shows a difference, a big difference, a dramatic difference from last year, and is also important for us to understand when we look at it from the perspective of American Jewry. So we asked, we asked what are the most important issues that the party that you plan to vote for, you want that party to advance in its work, in its parliamentary or governmental work. So what are the most important things for you to have those that represent you push? So we asked one general question, and all the others are specific, tangible issues that occupy the public discourse and are on the agenda, the public agenda regarding conflicts of religion and state. So the highest percentage, 37%, are saying religious freedom and equality in bearing the civil burden, namely the general principle of freedom of religion and equality, are what we want the party that we vote for to advance. That's very important and very encouraging. But when we look at the specifics, what we see are 2 things. First of all, look at the last one, recognition of equal status of non-Orthodox Jewish streams, Reform and Conservative. And in the past, we also asked about who is a Jew. We asked about women of the wall. You will see in other questions that we asked in the index, in the survey, that there is a majority support. There is a majority support for equal rights for the streams. There is a majority support for the ability of women of the wall and egalitarian services at the wall, and there is a majority for taking the monopoly over who is a Jew away from the chief rabbinate. All of that is true. But when you look at this comparative list, what you realize is, yes, the Israeli adult Jewish majority may support it, but frankly, it's just not that important to them. What is important currently to the adult Jewish population. So, prohibiting exclusion of women in the public sphere, namely undermining gender equality, and allowing public transportation on Shabbat, and conscription of yeshiva students to the IDF or civil service. Now, this is very interesting because on these 3 counts, there has been a hike, a jump from last year to this year. And this has to do with the fact that these are 3 items, 3 issues that are occupying the mind and the public and the contents of the protest movement. These 3 things, and if you are watching video coverage from the protests in Israel, you have seen the red maids, the red handmaids. The issue of gender equality is very central to the protest movement because people realize that the threat of these judicial initiatives or legislative initiatives is going to be hurting gender equality in Israel. Same story about public transportation on Shabbat, the whole controversy regarding the light rail in Tel Aviv. All of that has become, very high in people's consciousness and very high in the protest movement and advocacy efforts. And the issue of conscription. This is going to be the next item on the Knesset legislative agenda when the Knesset resumes the winter session in October, and the public hates it. The public hates it, and Netanyahu and the Likud understand it, and therefore they are trying to play around, but without any leeway, because the ultra-Orthodox parties have sort of bound their hands in the coalition agreements, and they insist that laws be passed that would ensure that no yeshiva student will be drafted against his will. Well, no yeshiva student wants to be drafted, and therefore no yeshiva student would be drafted. They don't want to hear about a minimal quota, binding quota. They don't want to hear about economic sanctions. They don't want to hear about anything. That's the origin of the push for the override clause that we have discussed often in these webinars. This is the source of the attempt to pass a new basic law on the study of Torah, which would, and that further infuriated the Israelis, which would make sort of an equation between the study of Torah and those who serve in the army. So these 3 topics have jumped to the head compared to last year. And of course, the next topic is civil marriage and divorce. So when we look at the issues, these are the top issues that Israelis care about. And when we talk about developing a common agenda with Israelis, between American Jews and Israelis, we need to understand that it has to take into consideration that, of course, you may take the least popular topics or the topics that the average Israeli least cares about and say, that's important for us. This is what we expect you to, to push and advocate for. Well, you got a tough job ahead of you. But as I've said before on a number of occasions, you may not be choosing to speak about conscription, but gender equality, freedom of marriage are 2 examples of topics that are clearly supported by the overwhelming majority of American Jewry and would resonate with the majority of Israelis. So I mentioned before, yes, there is support, 59%. It's not the highest majority, but 59% support equal recognition of the 3 major streams in Judaism. And if there are Reconstructionist colleagues here, please bear in mind, we asked about the 3 major religious streams in Judaism because the average Israeli doesn't really know of Reconstructionism. That's really a rarity. So when there is more awareness in Israel of Reconstructionist Judaism, we certainly do not intend to discriminate against Reconstructionist or renewal when we ask the question of pluralism. And again, obviously, you see the difference in terms of religious identity. Only 59% of the overall Jewish population support it, but when it comes to the secular, 88% support it. When it comes to traditional non-religious, 65%. And again, you see the difference between the traditional non-religious and the traditional close to religion. And who is a Jew? Again, 56%, not a huge majority, but 56% are saying we oppose the monopoly of the chief rabbinate over conversion. We support both non-chief rabbinate Orthodox conversions as well as Reform and Conservative conversions to be recognized equally to those of the chief rabbinate. And the last question that I will share with you on that is a key question that I'm often asked, namely, what about diaspora Jewry's involvement in strengthening religious freedom and pluralism in Israel? So often we hear, what right do we have to intervene? What right do we have to interfere? Do Israelis want us to be involved and to get engaged? And what I have been saying, and I'm showing you the figures, when you ask Israelis, should the government take into consideration American Jewish position on where the borders should, cross? Or how the peace process should be waged? The answer is, for most Israelis, no. That's really not for American Jews to decide. But when it comes to religious freedom and pluralism, Israelis are saying, bring it on. We want it, we support it, we could use all the help we can get. So 62% support it. Sorry?
What's the message?
Well, whoever spoke, please mute yourself. Well.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, bye.
Okay. So that same question, when we look at the different the religious groupings, subgroups in Israel, as you can see, 87% of the secular say, yes, we support your engagement, we want you to become involved, and 73% of the traditional non-religious. And if you remember, between the secular and the traditional non-religious, that makes up 64% of the adult Jewish population in Israel. All right, we'll end one moment. Okay. We'll end the religion and state index presentation with that. And what I realize is we covered a lot of territory, but with very little time to be together. So let me say a few things about the Supreme Court hearing, and let me see. There's a lot on the chat. Okay. So I'll just say a few things about the court, and then let me take a look at the chat and see what I can respond to. So in the U.S. Supreme Court, as I understand it, and I'm sorry, there are experts on this call, I am not, but they're very strict about time allocation to the different parties, and then there is sort of the clock, the lights, and when your time is up, your time is up. And if the justices ask you questions, that's none, that doesn't give you more time. You have to somehow fit it in, if I'm right. So the Chief Justice announced that the hearing last week would take 6.5 hours, allocating an hour to each of the respondents. The respondents argued first, namely the Knesset, the government, the head of the Law and Constitution Committee, etc. And the petitioners would be given 25 minutes each, and there would be a brief opportunity for the respondents to respond. Well, this is Israel, so, and there is no clock. So the 6.5 hours turned into 13.5 hours. The hearing took 13.5 hours all the way through. I mean, with a half an hour break and I think 1 or 2 15-minute breaks. There were 8 petitions and additional 3 petitions that were labeled as Friends of the Court briefs. That all argued, and of course, as I said, the respondents. Now, Steve Greenwald from the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, of course, is trying to get Elliot. It'll come back to me. The former Minister of Justice in Canada, right? What's his name?
Erwin Kotler.
Yes, Erwin Kotler. Thank you. So Steve is trying to get Erwin Kotler to speak at one of our webinars because Erwin Kotler and the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists submitted a petition and try to bring into the case the perspective of world Jewry. They submitted a great petition, but what happened was there were quite a number of petitions that were submitted after the first 8 were submitted. And the court said, enough is enough. We can't hear all these petitions. And said, we draw the line, and other petitions, yes, we acknowledge the filing, but we will not hear them at this time. So I hope that Erwin Kotler will be able to join us and share with us. We spoke about the gender equality angle. It'll be fascinating to hear the world Jewry perspective from the side of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists.
Well,
yes,
the IJL joined, in effect, the Israel Bar Association brief. That's
good. So, okay. Well, the Israel Bar Association was one of the petitioners, which, by the way, is very interesting because the Israel Bar Association is usually not getting involved in sort of public existential disputes, public constitutional disputes, and that also sort of indicates how unique and how serious this case has been, this issue has been seen. All right, so 8 petitions, 3 friends of the court, 13.5 hours, and some, by the way, one justice that for 13.5 hours didn't say one word. That's quite a power of restraint, amazing. But a number of justices spoke and gave sort of a hint as to where they are, or implied through their questions where they are. There were some even arguments between justices throughout the proceedings, and the bottom line is that it is reaffirmed that there is a liberal majority on the court and a conservative minority on the court. Now, having a liberal majority does not mean that the petitions that aim at having the court void the constitutional amendment that was passed by the Knesset regarding the authority of courts in Israel to review executive actions, and specifically the amendment dealt with decisions made by the government and individual ministers. So blocking the way of the courts to pass judicial review over government and ministers' actions and inactions and appointments based on what's called the reasonableness doctrine. And you heard about the reasonableness doctrine from Professor Rivka Weil. If there is need, I'll say a word about it. But the point is that there are a variety of doctrines that enable the court to pass judicial review in administrative law, such as illegality, acting out of, ultra vires, out of authority, acting based on ill considerations, ulterior considerations, lack of proportionality, arbitrariness, etc. But then, less than 2 times a year, there have been 19 cases over the course of the last 10 years in which the Supreme Court based its decision on the reasonableness doctrine. And the consensus, wide consensus among the legal community, with some exceptions, but wide consensus, and certainly among the public that's exposed to the controversy, removing the ability of the court to apply the reasonableness clause is a serious hindrance to the independence and the authority of the court, and a serious threat to the ability of the courts to protect civil liberties. Because when you can prove ill considerations or ulterior motives, there is no problem. When an act is done illegally, there is no problem. But there are those instances in which you can't really prove the motivation. There is no clear illegality involved. And in a way, in the deliberations, the representative of the Knesset and the representative of the government agreed that the fact that the court was now denied the ability to pass judicial review based on unreasonableness of the act or the inaction or the appointment does not mean that the government can act unreasonably. Except the Chief Justice and I think 1 or 2 other justices kept asking them, so what does that mean? You agree that the government has to act within the reasonableness framework. But, and you often say so many things sound better in Yiddish, this one sounds better in Hebrew. So the question the Chief Justice Chayut was asking, so what are you telling us? That there is yesh din aval ein dayan. So it's a play on words because it's the same root. There is a law, namely the government, the ministers still have to operate within the framework of reasonableness, but there is no judge that can monitor that. There is no judge that can review it and pass judicial a decision based on this unreasonableness. And what did the respondents on behalf of the Knesset and mostly the government respond? The representative said, trust us. It's going to be okay. As a matter of fact, this was the answer they gave in the past when people raised concerns about undermining civil liberties in Israel, and the response was, we, the Knesset, will defend your civil liberties. And this was considered to be in the category of humor more than any other relevant category. So one answer was, trust us, we'll act reasonably. The representative of the Knesset said, well, you know, they are the legal advisors. They'll be telling us that we are acting unreasonably. And surely the Knesset members are going to be guided by that. And one of the justices said to the representative of the Knesset, well, you may not have been here very long. It seems that what you are saying is somewhat removed from the reality as we know it. And obviously that was an understatement. The other question, the other response, which is personally, I have to say, the most infuriating. The public will monitor the reasonableness of the actions of the government. Namely, every 4 years we have elections. So if the government acted unreasonably, clearly the public will take them to task. This is the most cynical response that one, even worse than trust us, the most cynical response, because what it invokes is, you know, it's the power of the people. Yes, it's the power of the people, but there is no referendum in Israel. These are individual instances, and one of the justices asked, what do you mean? There is an individual who is denied a license or a permit and claims that the denial is primarily wrong because that the decision was unreasonable. You know, they can't prove the specific ill will that was behind it. It's within the authority of the minister to grant or not to grant. But the decision was unreasonable. What are you telling us, asked the justice, that this individual is going to be denied the ability and should start a new party, and this new party should be challenging the minister and should be challenging the party that he represents when elections come 2 years later? I mean, totally unrealistic and totally cynical. The arguments, as I said, took 13 and a half hours, were broadcast, and the whole idea of broadcasting hearings in Israel is new. It was a fascinating opportunity for the public to see at close range. Apparently, YouTube figures are that there were over on YouTube. There was also ability to see it on the Supreme Court website, but through YouTube there were over 200,000 people that watched the proceedings. Over 200,000. The bottom line is the court has a number of options, and it's not clear what option it will choose. Both the representative of the government and mostly the arrogant chair of the Law and Constitution Committee, M.K. Rothman, basically threatened the court. The chair of the Law and Constitution Committee that started out basically playing sort of a trick with the whole initiative to pass that constitutional amendment to the basic law on the judiciary. He played a trick because usually the government initiates such amendments. The government did not initiate that amendment. Then the alternative usually is a private member's bill, but a private member's bill goes through 4 readings. The first reading is the preliminary reading, and then it goes through the 3 other readings: first reading, second reading, and third reading. What he did is he personally brought the the amendment to the Law and Constitution Committee, labeled it the committee's proposal in order to circumvent the preliminary reading that is required of private members' bills. But putting that aside, he has consistently threatened the court during the hearing, caused quite a bit of ire among the Knesset, the justices. Oddly, the one who, they were torn. They certainly did not want to start a scene. But the one who finally couldn't hold himself was the Arab judge on the court, Judge Kabub, who asked him, who basically challenged him, are you trying to threaten us or something like that? Rothman spoke to the court saying, you are an elitist oligarchy, and the only thing that interests you is your rights and your honor. And basically threatened them that if they don't desist from reviewing the constitutionality of this amendment, they'll be bringing about a chaos and you know, a conflict that should be avoided. The representative of the government, in addition to observers saying, you know, he was not the best presenter of the legal claims on behalf of the government, not the best mind in the you know, constitutional and administrative law, but he caused quite an uproar when at some point one of the justices pressured him, by the way, a conservative judge, Justice Professor Alex Stein, pressured him, on what basis does the Knesset act when it acts in a constituent authority passing constitutional legislation? And he tried to avoid the answer, basically said, well, it's the power of the people or something like that. But the argument, sort of the other argument that arose is based on the Declaration of Independence. And I won't go into the technicalities. So when the Declaration of Independence was mentioned, his response was, Declaration of Independence? What are you talking about? This is something that 37 people who no one appointed, you know, wrote in a hurried manner. And you want this to bind our hands forever? So this was not welcomed by either the justices or the public, the dismissive statements that he made regarding the Declaration of Independence. He tried to then explain himself that he didn't really mean it, but that was too little, too late, and really did not make sense to most who heard him. So the court may indeed decide. Now, when I say may indeed decide, so what's the timetable? First of all, the parties have 21 days to submit additional written arguments. The court limited them by 10 pages. The representative of the Knesset protested, so the Chief Justice changed and said, okay, 15 pages. So they have 21 days to submit additional written arguments in case they couldn't quite present all their arguments during the hearing. And then the court will decide. Now, we know that there is a time constraint because Chief Justice Esther Chayut, there's mandatory retirement for judges in Israel at the age of 70. And Justice Chayut is retiring from the court when she reaches the age of 70, which will be in October. And by law, she can still participate in writing decisions on cases that she heard for 3 months from the retirement, from the stepping down date. So sometime in January is the latest date that one expects a ruling on this. The ruling may be that the court, as the Attorney General, in a most unprecedented, by many unexpected position, the Attorney General sided with the petitioners and urged the court to declare the amendment to be an unconstitutional constitutional amendment and void it. So one possibility is for the court to indeed void the amendment. And there was a whole question of what power does the court have to pass judicial review over constitutional amendments. We didn't speak about it. We don't have time. I'm watching the clock, and I realize we are already running out of time. But that's one possibility. The other possibility is to say, we don't like that amendment. We feel it'll constrain, it'll undermine certain levels of judicial review, or it will threaten certain civil liberties that may not be as properly as guarded as before, when we could apply the reasonableness doctrine, but we do not feel either that we have the authority, which is doubtful because many of the judges actually said we do have the authority, but they may say we don't feel that this case warrants our using that authority, or it'll say something along the third option. We are not voiding it, but we are limiting its interpretation. We are limiting its application. It's tough because there were some contradictions when the Knesset spoke, and between the Knesset and the government, as to whether the amendment that voided the reasonableness doctrine was total and complete, or whether it was open to interpretation. Not at all clear. But the court may say something along those lines, or it may take a technical approach and send it back to the Knesset for some reconsideration in terms of the procedure, also unlikely. And we have to remember, of course, that some are saying, while this may be wrong and bad and then dangerous, etc., the court has other weapons, so to speak, other techniques to pass judicial review of executive acts or governmental and ministerial acts. Also a tough proposition, but that is an option. All right, I realize that there are 30 comments in the chat and we are out of time. So maybe Peter, as co-chair of J-Plan, what do you want to state, ask? And I promise you, we will go over all the questions and comments and relate to them when we send you the review. Peter, do you want to say something?
On this last part about the reasonableness doctrine, a lot of what I did as a judge reviewing government actions was as to whether they were reasonable or arbitrary. That clause is far more serious, in my mind, than it may appear on the surface. As you said, Ori, you cannot duck the issue of reasonableness in most cases, whether a local decision is reasonable. May not be totally illegal or unauthorized, but it can be unreasonable. So in my view, if you applied that doctrine in the U.S., that law in the U.S., you would have unfettered and unchecked chaos. So I'm thinking that that law is a real serious threat to the rule of law.
Thank you. So based both on experience and legal knowledge, David, co-chair of JPlan, do you want to make a statement or ask or comment?
I guess my question to you would be like, where do you see all of this going? I, as you know, have been sort of beating my head against the wall trying to get the mainstream Jewish organizations here in America that I'm involved with to say something on this, and for the most part, they really haven't. But at the same time, like we're hearing from, your presentation is very sort of factual about what's going on, but I've heard webinars from protesters and stuff who say, like, they think this is essentially the end of Israel, that you're seeing these surveys that say at least 1 in 4 Israelis is thinking about leaving the country. Where do you see all this heading at this point? Do you think that this is going to continue down this extremist path, or are we going to pull back from the brink?
Well, first of all, definitely my account was factual because that was what I defined as the topic for this webinar. But you realize that Wednesday, tomorrow, and Friday are going to be crucial days. I have to tell you, yes, the much of the established leadership of the Jewish community is still sitting on the fence. But I have to say, listening to Rabbi Angela Buchtal on Rosh Hashanah at Central, and much to my surprise, seeing that Daniel Kahneman, Angela, and Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, probably the most important conservative rabbi in America today, are going to lead the protest across from the UN on Friday. And Elliot Cosgrove, I don't think that he said a critical word of Israel in his illustrious career until now. At least I'm not aware of it. He actually avoided being critical at almost all cost. What I'm saying is, I think that we are dealing with a growing challenge that the Jewish community will be facing to keep out of it. I heard from one of the leaders of the protest movement who is there in New York that once Angela delivered her sermon, she has been bombarded by other synagogues who called her up and said, give us the details. We want to participate. And it'll be, I think, at a point where the justice on who is a Jew, the leadership of the Jewish community did not act because they felt in their kishkes that this was the right thing to do, but rather they felt that grassroots was challenging them to the point that they couldn't afford not to take a stand. So they acted very effectively once they felt that the pressure was on. This may happen now. I don't know. You know the American Jewish community better than I do. But here in Israel, let there be no misunderstanding. When Prime Minister Netanyahu leaves the country and the last thing he says is that the protests are like the BDS and Iran or the PLO, I forget, one of them, he said, he gave one set of analogy between the protesters and Israel's enemies, and another one spoke about Iran and the PLO. Once this attorney that represented the government said, you talk about the Declaration of Independence, as I told you, 37 people, no one elected them, and they signed the paper which they hurriedly put together. That gave additional gas, additional impetus to the protest movement. It's going to grow. Now, yes, there may be those who are talking about relocation. There may be those who'll be considering leaving. But at this point, the most active characteristic element of the public response to what is happening is the protest. A growingly strong protest, a impactful protest, powerful protest, and I frankly think that the government is not going to be able to withstand it, especially as you see, and again, you have the hallucinatory, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, but Netanyahu is not that. And when Netanyahu realizes what he's going through with President Biden, he understands that this isn't a coincidence. This isn't just a conflict of scheduling. And and it seems that the agreement with Saudi Arabia is of importance to him in terms of his legacy, in terms of what he considers to be Israel's strategic interests. So when you bear that in mind, you realize that Netanyahu is under tremendous pressure. And when he responds, well, Levin's original proposal, the Minister of Justice, was bad, and I opposed it, and I blocked it. And then he said, well, I didn't really block everything. I blocked the override clause. And then again, he says, I will only tweak the appointment of judges a little bit, and that's going to be it. We'll look for wide consent. All of that means that, at least for Netanyahu, and some of the more reasonable individuals that are around him, this is not something that they will allow to happen. So you ask me, I'm still optimistic. But I think it's very important for the American Jewish leadership, as Angela Buchtal called and many others are calling, to take up the cause and be active in it. My concern, I won't speak about it, but I mentioned it in the previous webinar. My concern is that in saying to the government, you need to, lay off this judicial upheaval, we must take this opportunity and move one step further and say it can't be that we'll go back to yesterday as if yesterday was so great, and if only we could go back to yesterday, then everything is going to be okay. That's just not enough at this point.
Larry, I just want to point out for people, I put a couple of three things in the chat. You mentioned Rabbi Buchtal and Rabbi Cosgrove. Arnie Eisen, the former chancellor of JTS, also wrote a piece recently. I think that's sort of significant coming from the conservative movement. And there was also another sermon by Rabbi Rachel Timoner, I believe is her name, that I thought was, I know that Rabbi Buchtal has got, sort of a more prominent platform, but I actually thought that Rabbi Timoner had an even more impassioned sermon. And then, the first two links I sent are to those. I also just found out today, actually from Arnie Eisen, that there is a solidarity mission being put together for October 20th through 23rd, meeting with Yossi Klein Halevi and others that at least I'm thinking about joining, because I've been struggling for ways as an American Jew to do something tangible here, and maybe that's it.
That's great. And if you want to share something, at least with those who signed up for this webinar and maybe beyond that, send it to me and we'll include it in the materials. We'll send out.
I'll send it to you right now, Larry.
Well, okay, but what I'm saying is, if there is a mission and they're looking for people to participate, etc. But all right, is there someone who feels compelled to say something right now? And if not, we'll close. And as I said, we'll do our best to respond to the other comments and questions that we'll go over carefully after this webinar. Anything that someone feels because I did not manage to see, that someone feels, great, pressure to say or to ask. All right. Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova. It's good that we are talking during these days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. This is a time for renewal. This is a time for soul searching. This is a time for making commitments to be further active, further engaged, expand our horizons. And as I try to share with you, based on the Religion and State Index, the character of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Israel may be 75 years old, but we are still writing the ABCs of its backbone. We are still shaping its face, shaping its identity. And whereas, on the one hand, the judicial upheaval threatens Israel's democratic backbone, and I know that so much of that, and the public knows, so much of that is connected with Israel's Jewish backbone. So let's recommit to work together, keep informed, and I hope be able to work together to pursue an alternative paradigm for Israel as a Jewish democratic state, as outlined in a vision statement that Rabbi Mark Angel and I endorsed by numerous Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal, and unaffiliated, both in America, in Israel, and a few other countries, have put together a few years ago, but is so relevant now and so necessary now. And I hope that we'll be able to share it again, relaunch it, share it with you soon, and that you would consider this as an appropriate, integral element in our New Year's commitment. All right. Shana Tova, friends. It was wonderful.
Shana Tova, Chatima Tova.
Shana Tova.
שנה טובה, יישר כוח אורי. תודה רבה.
חתימה טובה.
תודה, תודה.
שנה טובה.
שנה טובה.